The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War, October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the moment during the Cold War when the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, came close to nuclear war. Secret communications and miscommunications which played out between the White House and the Kremlin made the crisis a unique event. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 by the Kennedy administration, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reached a secret agreement with Cuban Premier Fidel Castro to place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter any further US aggression. For some time, the Soviets had been sending surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles to Cuba, but President John F. Kennedy did not protest. However, he warned that if offensive weapons were sent to Cuba, that the gravest issues would arise. On October 14, 1962, US U-2 spy planes took several photos showing sites for medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles under construction in Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev, who had promised not to send offensive weapons to Cuba, had been lying. To help him deal with the crisis, Kennedy assembled a team called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM for short. At first, they favored bombing Cuba with debate over the scale of the attack. The president decided upon a middle course, and on October 22nd ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba, the term quarantine being used instead of blockade, as blockade assumed a state of war existed. Kennedy sent a letter to Khrushchev stating that the United States would not permit offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba, demanding that the Soviets dismantle the missile bases and return all offensive weapons to the USSR. He also went on national television to inform the public of the crisis, in which he said, "It shall be the policy of the nation to regard any nuclear missiles launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." On October 24th, Khrushchev responded to Kennedy describing the US blockade as an act of aggression, and the Soviet ships sent to Cuba would be ordered to keep going. Some Soviet ships turned back, and others proceeded. They were stopped by the US naval forces but were discovered to contain no offensive weapons. Nevertheless, US reconnaissance flights over Cuba indicated the Soviet missile sites were nearing operational readiness. With no clear solution to the crisis, the US forces were put at DEFCON 2. On 26 through 27 October, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a message stating that the USSR would remove missiles from Cuba in return for a promise from the United States not to invade the island. Resolution to the crisis was now looking hopeful, but later, a second letter was sent by Khrushchev which provoked debate again. It demanded that the deal would also require the removal of US Jupiter missiles from Turkey. That same day, a US U-2 reconnaissance jet was shot down over Cuba. Kennedy prepared for an attack on Cuba within days as they searched for any remaining diplomatic resolution. That night, Kennedy ignored Khrushchev's second message and proposed to the Soviet Union steps for the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba under supervision of the United Nations and a guarantee that the United States would not attack Cuba. Attorney General Robert Kennedy was sent to meet secretly with the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin and indicated that the United States were planning to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey anyway and within 6 months. This was to be kept top secret. The next morning on October 28th, Khrushchev issued a public statement that Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba. The crisis was over. The world escaped nuclear war in October 1962 largely because of the cautious natures of Kennedy and Khrushchev. In 1963, a telephone hotline was set up to give instant contact between the two leaders and a nuclear test ban treaty was signed. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, meaning the superpowers promised not to supply nuclear technology to other countries.
How to build a home fallout shelter in the Cold War. By 1961, the Cold War was heating up and the threat was becoming real as the Soviets had intercontinental ballistic missiles with sufficient range and numbers to threaten the mainland of America. These missiles carried nuclear warheads with the equivalent explosive power of 3 million tons of TNT. A direct hit from one of these missiles or being within hundreds of yards of one detonating meant certain death, whether you were in a shelter or not, as either the blast, the 500-mile-an-hour shockwave, or the massive burst of radiation would almost certainly kill you. But in a fallout shelter, if you were several miles away from the impact site, you might stand some kind of a chance, and this is what they were designed for. There was neither the money nor necessary planning in place. The federal government's strategy was to try and persuade the American public for the need for personal shelters and to take responsibility to prepare for the worst, rather than rely on the government to provide mass public shelters and support. So suddenly, there was a need to try and protect the civilian population from such devastation by encouraging the building of personal fallout shelters. After a nuclear attack, given that you survived the blast, there was the danger of radioactive fallout that could contaminate the air and soil, lasting for weeks, months, or even years in the surrounding environment. So the fallout shelter had to be designed to shield people from these effects. One option was to buy a prefabricated shelter, which was like a steel cylinder with a submarine-style hatch. Another was the several possible private shelter designs to build both underground and overground in such areas as the basement or your backyard. Instruction manuals and TV shows demonstrated to the American public how to build them as a do-it-yourself project. The shelter's walls and roof could be built from solid, thick concrete blocks to absorb and shield from radiation. The entrance, no more than 2 feet wide, was strictly built with a right-angled turn to prevent most of the radiation rays getting in as radiation travels in a straight line. If it was outside in the backyard, a hatch would provide entry. A basic basement shelter, according to the manuals, could be built for $150 to $200 at the time. Ventilation was supplied by vents in the bottom of the shelter wall and with air vent pipes which were attached to a filter mechanism on the surface. Turning a hand-cranked blower attached to the vent pipe would bring in fresh air. With fallout shelters, there was a real fear that unprepared neighbors in desperation might try to enter the shelter, so sometimes air vents that lead to the surface were camouflaged and tamper-proof. Heat could build up very quickly in a small confined shelter because of the occupant's body heat and because earth is a good thermal insulator. Climate control therefore could aid in cooling, but it was an expensive feature of shelters. The shelter would be stocked with canned food and water rations required to survive an extended length of time. Supplies and equipment for sanitation as well as medical supplies were also stocked inside. One of the obvious problems, apart from rationing water for the duration of the shelter, was the toilet. A solution was to use a bag and a garbage can with a tight-fitting cover. The waste could be kept in the can until it was safe to leave the shelter. It was also important to keep a radio to stay in touch with other survivors and CONELRAD broadcasts. Ideally, an electrical generator was installed in the shelter to provide lighting and other comforts of home. Whether a homemade do-it-yourself shelter would have been effective if a nuclear attack did take place during the Cold War is debatable. While they may have blocked radiation, the occupants may have suffered by the time it was okay to go back outside because of the lack of air handling and waste disposal systems, as well as the high temperatures. In 1959, the U.S. government produced a do-it-yourself book. It was later found out that only a small percentage of Americans had actually received and read it. In 1962, just 1.4% of Americans had a nuclear fallout shelter, which meant that 98.6% of people had to rely on federal or state or county shelters, and there were simply not enough of them. So what was the reason? It was likely cost. In a survey at the time, 67% of Americans simply felt they could not afford to build their own fallout shelter.
Sato Yaguchi, the man who survived 2 atomic bombs. No one encapsulates the idea of being in the wrong place at the wrong time more than Japanese engineer Sato Yaguchi, the first officially recognized survivor of 2 atomic bombs. It was the morning of August 6, 1945, and just 1 month away from the end of the Second World War. Yamaguchi had just finished a 3-month assignment in Hiroshima, where he worked designing oil tankers for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. He was about to start the long train journey home to Nagasaki to see his wife and newborn son, when the 29-year-old realized he had forgotten his hanko, an identification stamp common in Japan at the time. Once received and heading back home, he heard a rumbling in the air. Looking up, he saw an American B-29 bomber fly overhead, which, as Yamaguchi watched, deployed a small object that floated down to the city below, attached to 2 parachutes. The next thing he knew, the world exploded around him in a blinding magnesium-esque white light, and he had just enough time to dive into a nearby ditch before a sonic boom filled the atmosphere and everything turned black. When Yamaguchi awoke, the morning was still blanketed in darkness. Soot and debris from the explosion had almost eclipsed the morning sun. His eardrums had burst, and his face and arms were burning, He was less than 2 miles from ground zero, and yet somehow, miraculously, alive. Others weren't so lucky. Approximately 30% of the city died in the blast, and tens of thousands more followed in the ensuing months. Years later, he described his thoughts following the bombings in a British interview. "I saw a huge mushroom-shaped pillar of fire rising high into the sky. It was like a tornado, but it didn't move. But it rose and spread out horizontally at the top. There was prismatic light, which was changing in a complicated rhythm, like the patterns of a kaleidoscope. The first thing I did was to check to see I still had my legs and whether I could move them. I thought, if I stay here, I'll die." And so, 2 hours later, a dazed Yaguchi resumed his trek to what remained of the shipyard he worked in. There, he found that 2 of his colleagues, Akira Iwanaga and Kuniyoshi Sato, had survived. Unable to do much else, the 3 spent the rest of the day and the next night in an air raid shelter, before heading to a nearby railway station that was somehow still running. What they saw on their way was nothing short of nightmarish. Bodies littered the streets, and at one point the 3 men were forced to wade through a river of corpses where a bridge had collapsed. Finally, they reached a train full of equally as burnt and shell-shocked people heading for home or refuge in Nagasaki. Meanwhile, in America, President Truman had made a statement taking credit for the atomic bomb and warning the people of Japan of the U.S.'s plans if they did not surrender. "If they do not accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the likes of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware." With those unsettling words ringing in his ears, Yaguchi thought that the chances of a bomb dropping on Nagasaki were high. But despite all this, and everything else he had dealt with in the past 48 hours, not to mention the fact that he was seriously injured, Yaguchi still actually went into work the next day, on August 9th. Incredibly, the director of his branch was mad at the bandaged, injured, and yet somehow still at work Yaguchi. He yelled at him for losing his colleagues and told him he must have imagined that a single bomb destroyed Hiroshima and that he had gone a little mad. Imagine being caught up in a bomb, only to be yelled at by your boss a day later. A few moments later, a familiar, blinding white flash of light filled the office the 2 men stood arguing in, and for the second time in 3 days, the world exploded around Satomu Yaguchi. It was 11:02 a.m. on the 9th of August, and the second atomic bomb had just been dropped on Nagasaki. 70,000 more Japanese citizens died. Later, Yaguchi confessed that for a second, he thought that the mushroom cloud had followed him all the way from Hiroshima. Still badly injured and angry at the director, he ignored his cries for help, climbing out of the shattered window and running home to his wife and baby, who, luckily, were unharmed, except for a few cuts and bruises. There, Yaguchi collapsed, spending the next week hovering between life and death as his fever spiked and his now exposed wounds burned. The hospital had been destroyed, and there was no one to treat him in the midst of the chaos. When he finally came around, it was a week later, and there were cries and cheers in the air. Japan had just announced its surrender on the 15th of August, 1945. To this day, the morality and necessity of dropping atomic bombs on innocent civilians has been questioned and examined and re-examined. Did the earlier surrender by Japan justify the loss of life in the bombs? Or were they unnecessary evils that should be treated as war crimes? A little-known fact is that America had several more atomic bombs ready to go and were awaiting Truman's confirmation to continue the onslaught just 2 days before Japan surrendered. If this really had occurred, it would be difficult for anyone to see the U.S.'s argument that mass civilian casualties were a necessary part of the war, and today's view on America's involvement might be very different. The far-reaching effects of the bombs and subsequent radiation still play a part in the health of the children and grandchildren of survivors today. Yaguchi's own son sadly died of cancer at age 59 as a result of the exposure as a baby, and many more suffered similarly. Yaguchi himself outlived his son and most other Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors, but was rendered deaf in his left ear and wrapped in bandages for the years that followed. His wife sadly died from kidney and liver failure as a result of radiation poisoning at age 88. And as he got older, Yamaguchi experienced cataracts and acute leukemia. Despite this, Yamaguchi incredibly lived to 93 before succumbing to stomach cancer in 2010. Survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were called hibakusha by the Japanese government and were entitled to government support, allowances, and free medical care. Initially, Yamaguchi was only recognized as a survivor of the Nagasaki bombing, which he was fine with. But later in life, he decided it was important for his status to be officially recognized so that it can tell the younger generation the horrifying history of the atomic bombings. Although a 2016 documentary found 165 people who lived through both bombings, Satomu Yamaguchi is the person formally recognized by the Japanese government after applying for double recognition in January 2009 and being granted official dual survivor status 2 months later in March. In later years, when asked his opinion of the bombings, he would say, "They could have made their point by dropping one bomb. I think they were in a hurry to show their superiority. It would have been one thing if they had used it on a battlefield, but they knew that it would kill women, children, babies. How could they do that?" Although today we call Satomu Yamaguchi the luckiest man in history, it would perhaps be better for him to be known as the unluckiest lucky man, for he saw horrors many of us could not ever imagine facing.
What is Broken Arrow? The American military commonly uses acronyms, abbreviations, code words, and phrases in order to convey concepts and ideas in a more efficient way. One of these codes is Broken Arrow. Over the years, it has had several different meanings, all of which generally mean that someone is having a very bad day. Perhaps the most famous use of the code phrase Broken Arrow occurred in 1965. In November of that year, the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Air Cavalry Division, began a major offensive against NVA forces in the Nha Trang Valley in central Vietnam. Waiting for them were well-dug-in and prepared NVA regulars. For one of the first times in the conflict, the two forces would face each other in a major engagement. Landing at a location designated LZ X-Ray, the 450 men of the 1st Battalion engaged the NVA on November 14th. That day saw fierce fighting as the troopers fought desperately against elements of the 66th and 33rd NVA regiments, who were determined to overrun the invaders. At one point, a 29-man platoon was surrounded by over 200 NVA regulars, but managed to hold their ground, utilizing concentrated airstrikes and artillery barrages. All the while, Huey pilots risked the intense fire to deliver supplies and evacuate the wounded. The next day, the fighting renewed with an even greater ferocity. Pressing the attack, the NVA attempted to overrun a portion of the line held by C Company, while at the same time nearby D Company was also heavily engaged. Fighting devolved into hand-to-hand combat as both sides refused to give in. With the situation rapidly deteriorating, the code Broken Arrow was sent by Forward Observer Lieutenant Charlie Hastings, who was either ordered to do so by Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore or acted on his own initiative. Used in this context, Broken Arrow was a pre-arranged signal that an American unit was in imminent danger of being overrun and that all available air power was to divert to that location for close air support. When the message was relayed, aircraft around Vietnam immediately headed to the Nha Trang Valley to support the beleaguered troopers. Planes waited on station for their turn to drop their deadly payloads of high explosives and napalm on the advancing NVA forces, expending their ordnance dangerously close to American positions. For the next 3 hours, flights of ground attack aircraft, as well as a near-continuous barrage of 105mm howitzers from nearby Firebase Falcon, managed to stem the tide to the NVA assault. C Company held their position, but at a terrible cost. Over half of the men were either killed or wounded, and every officer in the company was a casualty. The next day, the 1st Battalion managed to extract from LZ X-Ray, suffering heavy casualties. The day after that, 2nd Battalion was attacked at nearby LZ Albany, suffering the heaviest number of casualties in a single day by U.S. forces in Vietnam, though the code was not called during this engagement in spite of the ferocious fighting that occurred there. There were some reports that Broken Arrow was used once more, this time in Afghanistan. In October 2009, the men of Bravo Troop 3rd Squadron 61st Cavalry Regiment 4th Infantry Division were stationed at Combat Outpost Keating near the Pakistani border. At 6 a.m., the outpost came under attack by concentrated Taliban forces. After a short time, it became obvious that this was not a simple raid or hit-and-run attack, but a sustained full-on effort. An estimated 300 to 400 Taliban fighters descended on the 53 Americans. At several points during the 13-hour firefight, the Taliban breached the perimeter and threatened to overrun the outpost. In desperation, the beleaguered troopers called in close air support. According to some reports of the battle, the code Broken Arrow was sent out, the first and only time since 1965 that this was used, though this is difficult to confirm. In any event, as was the case in Vietnam, the call meant that an American unit was being overrun and in imminent danger of destruction, and all available air power was to divert to their aid. With close air support dropping ordnance almost on top of the American positions, the troopers managed to stem the tide of the Taliban assault. Many acts of heroism were performed that day, including those of Staff Sergeant Clinton Romisha, who was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his conduct. Because it has been used so rarely, it is safe to assume that Broken Arrow, in this context, is reserved for times of extreme crisis, where there's no other course of action that can be taken to save a unit from destruction. This isn't the only meaning that Broken Arrow can take, however. Since the 1940s, many nations have maintained a sizable arsenal of nuclear warheads. Given the destructive nature of these weapons, the utmost care is taken when transporting or maintaining them. Still, no matter how careful, accidents do happen. In this context, Broken Arrow is any number of unexpected events involving nuclear warheads, including but not limited to accidental detonation, loss, theft, or any other accident, which does not result in nuclear war or any retaliatory response. Since 1950, there have been 32 broken arrows called in regards to nuclear weapons, as far as such information has been made public. The first of these incidents occurred on February 13, 1950. A B-36 Peacemaker bomber took off from Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska en route to Carswell Air Force Base in Texas. Shortly after taking off, the aircraft was plagued by mechanical issues. 3 of the 6 engines had to be shut down. Due to icing, the plane was unable to maintain altitude, and the crew jettisoned the bomb it was carrying over the Pacific Ocean. When it impacted the surface, the detonator triggered the warhead and exploded, destroying the weapon, though the warhead was not armed, so the blast was a conventional one, not nuclear. The crew bailed out over British Columbia without any casualties, with the wreckage of the aircraft recovered after crashing in Vancouver. The most recent incident happened in 2000 when the Russian nuclear submarine, the Kursk, was conducting a training exercise in the Barents Sea, north of the Arctic Circle. During the exercise, it is believed that a torpedo leaked hydrogen peroxide, causing a reaction, which ultimately led to the submarine sinking to the bottom of the sea. Although the Kursk did not have any nuclear warheads on board at the time of the accident, it was still considered a broken arrow situation as a precaution. None of the 118 crew on board survived the incident. It is important to note that a broken arrow situation does not necessarily mean there is an imminent or even possible risk of a nuclear detonation. Most scenarios involve mechanical issues during the transport of a nuclear warhead. In order for the nuke to detonate, it must be configured to do so and properly armed, and for obvious safety reasons, this is not done unless the weapon is being deployed. The most pressing concerns during a broken arrow incident is the leaking of radiation into the surrounding area, which can require extensive and specialized cleanup methods and can be hazardous to the environment and to public health and security concerns, since a lost nuclear warhead is a massive security risk for obvious reasons. The mass majority of broken arrow situations have been resolved with little, if any, impact on public safety or national security. In spite of this, to date, there are 6 warheads, as far as the public is aware, that are currently unaccounted for. They are in locations that are difficult, if not impossible, to retrieve, such as the bottom of the ocean, though there were many attempts to retrieve them and certainly more than a few sleepless nights regarding their fate. There are other terms used to describe mishaps that involve nuclear weapons or radioactive materials. These have a significant overlap with broken arrow and include empty quiver, which is the loss, seizure, or theft of a nuclear warhead; bent spear, which is an incident involving a nuclear weapon or warhead, nuclear components, or a nuclear-equipped vehicle; and fated giant, which involves a nuclear reactor or radiological accident. Of these, broken arrow is the most significant and the cause for the most concern. Military jargon is filled with codes and euphemisms, some more serious than others. Of these, should broken arrow be called out in earnest, it is clear that something has gone catastrophically wrong.
M.A.D. Mutually Assured Destruction. What does M.A.D mean? M.A.D refers to the full-scale use of nuclear weapons by two opposing sides, resulting in one clear, obvious outcome: mutually assured destruction. The policy of M.A.D rests on the idea that if two countries or continents are equally as capable of destroying one another through nuclear attack, then there is no incentive for either side to pull the trigger or remove it. M.A.D can be thought of as a giant game of nuclear war chicken. It's the delicate balance struck between these countries capable of such nuclear warfare that means neither side will use the technology. Instead, nuclear-capable countries will keep each other in check with the knowledge of the M.A.D doctrine, and that any sort of first move would result in global nuclear devastation. Another way to explain how the policy of M.A.D assures a tentative global nuclear peace is using Nash's equilibrium. Nash equilibrium proposes that in a game where each player knows the other's strategy, there is no benefit to changing your own. And that's where we find ourselves today. In a world where 8 or possibly 9 countries are capable of destroying the planet through nuclear war. We just have to hope no one is mad enough to launch the first strike. There are 8 countries known to be capable of nuclear warfare, having previously successfully detonated nuclear weapons. They are the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, France, China, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. There is only one other country that has never publicly announced their nuclear capabilities, although it's widely accepted that they have some nuclear technology, and that country is Israel. Of these countries, the first 5, UK, US, Russia, France, and China, are members of the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, meaning they're committed to stopping more countries from gaining nuclear power and using their own to create nuclear energy. Very convenient when you already have nuclear weapons yourself. But not all these countries are fully capable of enacting the M.A.D doctrine. Only countries who have 3 legs of nuclear power are considered truly capable of M.A.D, as their own nuclear weapons cannot be wiped out in a single strike. This is known as the nuclear triad, and in essence it means a country capable of launching nuclear weapons from 3 separate places: the land, sea, and sky. Of the aforementioned 8 countries, only 5 currently have this power: the United States, Russia, China, India, and France. The concept of M.A.D existed long before the term itself was actually coined by military strategist Donald Brennan in 1962. One of the first references comes from nearly 100 years earlier in 1870. Wilkie Collins, an English author, wrote of the Franco-Prussian War, "I begin to believe in only one civilizing influence, the discovery one of these days of a destructive agent so terrible that war shall mean annihilation, and men's fears will force them to keep the peace." The first ever example of a country owning nuclear weapons was in 1945, when the United States dropped nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, helping to end World War II while simultaneously beginning the Cold War. 4 years later, the Soviet Union publicly announced its own nuclear capabilities to the world by conducting a nuclear weapons test, detonating a bomb called the RDS-1. Upon the launch of the Soviet nuclear test, President Dwight Eisenhower of the United States announced a new strategic concept, the New Look policy. A main component of this new concept was massive retaliation, which argued the U.S. should be willing to use deterrent threats and tactical nuclear weaponry to halt the expansion of the Soviet nuclear program. This marks the start of the first true possibility of M.A.D. It should come as no surprise to learn that the 2 countries who have been capable of the nuclear triad for the longest are Russia and the United States. Their development of nuclear weaponry was fundamentally what led to the birth of the Cold War after World War II. The Cold War was a period of tension and political unrest felt worldwide, beginning at the end of the war and continuing all the way up to the late 1980s and early 1990s. There is no definitive end date to the Cold War, although the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent dissolution of the Soviet Union are generally considered to represent the pacification of the conflict. Nevertheless, the underlying threat of nuclear weaponry and the various knock-on effects of the period's proxy wars continued to be felt to this day. But it was in the 1960s when Cold War tensions and the threat of nuclear war reached an all-time high, with the world coming the closest it ever has to an all-out nuclear warfare during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred from October 16th to the 28th, 1962, and if not for one man, could have marked the end of the world. The crisis technically dates back a few years earlier to 1958, when the U.S. placed nuclear-armed ballistic missiles known as Jupiters in Italy and Turkey, directing them straight towards Russian targets. In the years that immediately followed, newly revolutionized Cuba was deeply alarmed by the impending threat of an American takeover, following the disastrous U.S.-backed Bay of Pigs invasion. In response, their leader Fidel Castro reached out to the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, offering to host Soviet nuclear launch sites on Cuban soil in an effort to deter any further American incursions. When President John F. Kennedy learned of this plan, he ordered a naval blockade of Cuba on October 22, 1962, kicking off the Cuban Missile Crisis and heightening the possibility of nuclear warfare becoming a reality. What followed was 6 days of tense meetings between the U.S. and the Soviets as they negotiated the disarmament of both the U.S.'s Jupiter missiles and the removal of any nuclear weapons already in Cuba. But it was during these negotiations that the scale came extremely close to tipping over, sending the world into total nuclear war and mutually assured destruction. In the midst of these negotiations, when each side was already assessing each other with extreme care, the U.S. did something incredibly risky and a bit stupid. A fleet of U.S. ships near Cuba identified a Soviet submarine lurking below the surface of the water. In an effort to force the submarine to identify itself and ignoring the rules of international waters, they began dropping signaling depth charges in an attempt to force the submarine to the surface. The Soviet submarine they attacked was called the B-59, and the crew on board hadn't heard from Moscow in a while. With no knowledge of what was going on above water and now finding themselves under bombardment, the men on board had to make a quick judgment call on if this meant nuclear war had broken out on the surface. The sub's captain, a man named Savitsky, quickly concluded that this meant war had broken out, and he immediately wanted to respond by launching a nuclear torpedo they had on board. But to do so, he needed one other man to agree, his chief of staff and the sub's executive officer, Vasily Arkhipov. Luckily for everyone, Arkhipov refused, saying they had to await orders from Moscow. Had he not, and Savitsky had launched that first nuclear strike, the world as we know it would not have survived. The next day, an agreement was reached on the surface between Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy, in which both countries would disarm their new forward nuclear stages. It was only much later that the world would become aware of how close the two powers had come to destroying the planet. Although Cold War tensions continued after this point, the Cuban Missile Crisis marks the most critical moment on the doomsday clock, in which the world was most likely to have erupted in potential nuclear annihilation. Since the end of the Cold War, there has not been a threat of M.A.D. that seemed truly credible until recent events. But the nuclear-capable countries have continued to research, expand, and evolve their understanding of nuclear warfare. The whole world remains in a state of perpetual potential for M.A.D. to occur, and although the original doctrine refers to two countries destroying each other, with the nuclear weapons that exist today, if any country were to truly exercise their nuclear power, it would likely spell the end for humanity.